What kind of land defeats the most powerful empires on Earth, again and again, for thousands of years? A land where ancient kings disappeared into mountains, where superpowers arrived with armies, weapons, and pride, but eventually left with fear, destruction, and unanswered questions. This is not just the story of a country. This is the story of a land that witnessed the footsteps of Alexander the Great, the rise of Islamic empires, the invasion of the Mongols, the ambitions of the British Empire, the fury of the Soviet Union, and the longest war in modern American history. And yet somehow, through centuries of blood, betrayal, war, and foreign invasion, Afghanistan still survived. But why? Why has this land always been impossible to control? Why do historians call it the graveyard of empires? And what is the hidden story the world still does not fully understand about Afghanistan? Because once you truly understand this country, you begin to understand something much bigger about power, survival, faith, and human history itself. And before we begin, tell me where you are watching this documentary from, and what time it is in your city or country right now. And that is where the next chapter begins. By the time Islam began spreading toward the lands of Afghanistan, this region had already witnessed centuries of invasion, destruction, migration, trade, and cultural transformation. Empires had come and disappeared. Kings had risen and fallen, religions had spread across valleys and mountains, only to weaken with time. But something about the arrival of Islam was different from everything Afghanistan had experienced before. Because Islam did not simply conquer territory, it transformed identity. Beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries, Muslim armies and Islamic civilization gradually expanded eastward, after the rise of Islam in Arabia. At first, the expansion into Afghanistan was slow and difficult. The mountainous terrain created enormous military challenges. Local tribes resisted foreign control fiercely. Many regions remained isolated for long periods. But unlike temporary invasions of the past, Islam slowly rooted itself deeply into Afghan society, not only through political power, but through faith, trade, scholarship, spirituality, and daily life. Over generations, Islam became woven into the soul of the region. Mosques appeared where ancient temples once stood. Islamic scholars traveled through Afghan cities teaching knowledge. Caravans carrying Qurans, books, and ideas crossed dangerous mountain roads. Persian Islamic culture mixed with local traditions and tribal structures. And gradually, Afghanistan became one of the important centers of the Islamic world. This transformation changed everything. The people of Afghanistan were no longer only connected through tribes or geography. Now they shared a larger spiritual identity connected to a civilization stretching from Arabia to Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. But Afghanistan still remained Afghanistan, independent, difficult, unpredictable. Even under Islamic dynasties, local tribal systems remained powerful. In many regions, tribal loyalty stood beside religious identity as one of the strongest forces shaping Afghan life. Family honor became sacred. Revenge traditions survived. Warrior culture remained deeply respected. Hospitality toward guests became part of social identity. Courage in battle became legendary. Afghan society developed around survival in harsh terrain where weakness could be deadly. And over centuries, the people of this land became known for something feared by outsiders. They could endure suffering longer than most invading armies could endure war itself. This would become one of the greatest hidden strengths in Afghan history. Because empires usually depend on comfort, money, organized systems, and long supply lines. But Afghanistan's tribes often survived with almost nothing. A foreign empire losing resources thousands of miles from home eventually becomes exhausted. But local fighters defending mountains they grew up in could continue resisting for years, sometimes decades. This pattern would repeat throughout history so many times that Afghanistan eventually gained a terrifying reputation. But long before modern wars, Afghanistan first became powerful through Islamic civilization itself. Several important Islamic dynasties emerged from or ruled through the region. One of the most famous was the Ghaznavid Empire. Under rulers like Mahmud of Ghazni during the 10th and 11th centuries, Afghanistan became a major center of military power, trade, architecture, scholarship, and Islamic influence. The city of Ghazni grew into one of the great cities of the Islamic world. Poets, scholars, scientists, and travelers gathered there. Libraries expanded. Mosques and palaces rose across the region. Trade flourished through routes connecting multiple civilizations. And from Afghanistan, Islamic influence expanded deeper into the Indian subcontinent. This period shaped South Asian history permanently. Many cultural, linguistic, and religious connections between Afghanistan and the Indian subcontinent grew during these centuries. But Afghanistan's story was never peaceful for long, because every time stability appeared, another storm eventually arrived. In the 13th century, that storm came in the form of the Mongols. The Mongol invasions under Genghis Khan and his successors became one of the darkest periods in Afghan history. Entire cities were destroyed with horrifying brutality. Ancient centers of learning disappeared beneath fire and massacre. Trade routes collapsed. Civilian populations suffered unimaginable devastation. Some historians describe rivers running red with blood after Mongol attacks. The destruction was so severe that certain regions took generations to recover economically and culturally. And yet, even the Mongols could not permanently erase Afghanistan. The mountains remained, the tribes remained, the spirit of resistance remained. After the Mongol period weakened, new Islamic powers emerged once again. Among the most important was the Timurid Empire. Under rulers connected to Timur, also known as Tamerlane, parts of Afghanistan experienced another cultural revival. Cities like Herat became famous centers of art, poetry, architecture, science, and Persian Islamic culture. Herat was once considered one of the most beautiful and intellectually advanced cities in the Islamic world. Artists created breathtaking manuscripts. Architects designed magnificent buildings. Scholars debated philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and theology. For a brief moment in history, Afghanistan was not merely surviving war, it was shaping civilization. But geography continued trapping Afghanistan between powerful rivals. To the west stood Persia. To the north and east rose Central Asian powers. To the south lay the growing influence of India. Afghanistan remained caught between empires competing for influence. And slowly, another force began rising that would shape the future of the region dramatically. The Pashtun tribes. Among Afghanistan's many ethnic and tribal groups, the Pashtuns gradually became one of the dominant political and military forces in the region. Strong tribal codes guided their society. Honor, revenge, loyalty, protection of guests, courage, independence. These values became deeply embedded into Afghan culture. Many outsiders misunderstood these tribal systems. Some viewed them as primitive, but in reality, they created one of the strongest resistance cultures in world history. Afghan tribes often refused centralized foreign authority, even when facing massive military powers. Control over Kabul did not always mean control over Afghanistan itself. This became one of the greatest mistakes foreign invaders repeatedly failed to understand. Because Afghanistan was never fully controlled, only through cities. Real power often lived inside mountains, villages, tribal alliances, and local loyalties outsiders could barely understand. And then, in the 18th century, something happened that changed Afghanistan forever. For the first time, the foundations of a unified Afghan state truly began emerging. A leader named Ahmad Shah Durrani rose to power, and many historians today call him the founder of modern Afghanistan. By the early 18th century, the land of Afghanistan had already survived waves of invasions, collapsing empires, tribal wars, Mongol destruction, and centuries of political instability. But despite its long and powerful history, Afghanistan still did not exist as a unified modern nation. The region remained divided between tribal territories, local rulers, and the influence of surrounding empires. To the west, Persia constantly fought for dominance. To the south, the Mughal Empire in India was weakening. To the north, Central Asian powers competed for influence. And throughout the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan itself, tribal loyalties remained stronger than centralized political authority. The land was powerful, but fragmented, and in moments like this throughout history, one leader often changes everything. For Afghanistan, that leader was Ahmad Shah Durrani. His rise marked one of the most important turning points in Afghan history. Born among the Pashtun tribes, Ahmad Shah was not simply a warrior. He was intelligent, strategic, patient, and deeply aware of how fragile the region truly was. After the assassination of the Persian ruler Nader Shah in 1747, a massive power vacuum spread across the region. Empires weakened, armies scattered, chaos expanded, and inside that chaos, Ahmad Shah saw opportunity. He gathered tribal leaders, built alliances, united competing groups, and slowly he laid the foundation for what would become modern Afghanistan. Many historians today call Ahmad Shah Durrani the father of Afghanistan, because for the first time, a ruler successfully united major Afghan tribes under one political structure, strong enough to create an actual state. This was not easy. Afghanistan had always resisted central authority. Tribes protected their independence fiercely. Local rivalries ran deep. Trust between groups was fragile. But Ahmad Shah understood something many rulers before him failed to understand. Afghanistan could not survive only through force. It needed balance. Balance between tribes. Balance between power and respect. Balance between unity and independence. And for a time, he achieved something extraordinary. The Durrani Empire expanded rapidly. At its height, it stretched across large parts of modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and India. Afghan armies became feared across the region. Cities flourished through trade. Political influence expanded, and Afghanistan finally emerged as a major regional power instead of merely a battleground between empires. For many Afghans, this period became a symbol of pride and strength, because after centuries of foreign domination and fragmentation, Afghanistan was now shaping history itself. But even during this rise, danger was quietly approaching from far beyond the mountains, a danger that would eventually change Afghanistan forever. The British Empire. At first, the British were not focused directly on Afghanistan. Their attention centered on India, and by the 19th century, Britain controlled enormous parts of the Indian subcontinent. The British Empire was becoming the most powerful empire on Earth. Its navy dominated oceans, its economy expanded globally, its military influence stretched across continents. But British leaders feared one thing deeply: Russia, far to the north. The Russian Empire was expanding aggressively through Central Asia. British officials became terrified that Russia might eventually move south toward India. And suddenly, Afghanistan became strategically critical, not because Britain loved Afghanistan, not because Russia loved Afghanistan, but because Afghanistan sat directly between two expanding superpowers. This rivalry became known as the Great Game, one of the most dangerous geopolitical struggles of the 19th century. Britain and Russia competed secretly and openly for influence across Central Asia. Spies traveled through mountains disguised as merchants and explorers. Political agents bribed tribal leaders. Maps were drawn secretly. Military plans expanded. Diplomatic betrayals spread everywhere. And trapped directly in the middle of this massive imperial rivalry was Afghanistan. This changed Afghan history forever, because from this point onward, foreign powers increasingly viewed Afghanistan not as a people with their own identity and history, but as a strategic prize, a buffer zone, a military gateway, a land that had to be controlled before rival empires controlled it first. And this mindset would lead directly to disaster. The British eventually decided they needed a friendly Afghan ruler loyal to British interests. But Afghanistan was not a land where outsiders could easily choose leaders for the people. British officials underestimated Afghan tribal dynamics completely. They believed military power and political pressure would be enough. They were wrong. In 1839, Britain launched the First Anglo-Afghan War. At first, the invasion appeared successful. British forces entered Afghanistan. Kabul fell. A ruler favorable to British interests was installed. From the outside, it looked like victory, but beneath the surface, anger was spreading rapidly. Afghans viewed the foreign occupation as humiliation. Tribal resistance slowly organized, local resentment intensified, and British troops stationed inside Afghanistan began growing dangerously overconfident. Many officers believed the war was essentially finished. Some even brought families and luxuries into Kabul, as if Afghanistan had already surrendered permanently. They did not understand the land they occupied. And then, everything collapsed. In 1841, massive uprisings exploded across Kabul and surrounding regions. Afghan resistance fighters attacked British positions relentlessly. Supply lines collapsed. Winter conditions became brutal. Fear spread through British ranks. Eventually, British forces attempted to retreat from Kabul. What happened next shocked the entire world. Around 16,000 people, including soldiers, families, servants, and camp followers, began retreating through freezing mountain passes toward Jalalabad. Afghan fighters attacked continuously from the mountains. Snow covered the ground. Starvation spread. Chaos consumed the retreat. One by one, the retreating column was destroyed. Almost nobody survived. According to famous historical accounts, only one exhausted British survivor reached Jalalabad alive. The British Empire was humiliated. One of the most powerful empires on earth had entered Afghanistan confidently and left in disaster. The message spread across the world rapidly. Afghanistan was not easy to conquer, and this moment helped build the terrifying reputation Afghanistan would carry into future centuries. The graveyard of empires. But the British still did not fully learn the lesson, because Afghanistan's strategic position remained too important to ignore, and over the coming decades, the British would return again. More wars, more invasions, more resistance, more bloodshed, because the great empires of the world kept believing the same dangerous thing, that Afghanistan could finally be controlled, and history kept answering them the same way. After the humiliating disaster of the First Anglo-Afghan War, the British Empire should have understood one painful truth about Afghanistan. Military invasion and political control were not the same thing. Capturing cities did not mean capturing the country. Installing rulers did not mean controlling the people. Winning battles did not mean winning Afghanistan itself. But empires rarely accept humiliation quietly, especially the British Empire at the height of its global power. During the 19th century, Britain ruled territories across nearly every continent on Earth. Its navy dominated oceans. Its economy fueled industrial expansion. Its military power terrified nations across the world. The empire believed it could shape the future of entire civilizations. And because Afghanistan remained strategically positioned between British India and the expanding Russian Empire, British leaders could not simply ignore it. The fear of Russian expansion continued haunting British officials constantly. Every Russian movement through Central Asia increased anxiety inside London and British-controlled India. The British believed that if Russia ever gained strong influence inside Afghanistan, India itself could eventually become vulnerable. And India was not just another colony. India was the crown jewel of the British Empire. Losing influence near Afghanistan felt unacceptable. So despite previous disaster, Britain slowly moved toward Afghanistan once again. But Afghanistan itself was also changing internally during this period. The country remained politically fragile. Different tribal alliances competed for influence. Regional leaders struggled for power. Internal conflicts weakened stability, and centralized authority over the entire country remained difficult even for Afghan rulers themselves. This instability created opportunities for foreign manipulation. Outside powers often supported rival leaders, secretly hoping to gain influence without direct occupation. Afghanistan increasingly became trapped between global imperial ambitions and internal political divisions. And unfortunately for the Afghan people, this would bring endless suffering. In 1878, the British launched the Second Anglo-Afghan War. This time, Britain wanted even stronger control over Afghan foreign policy and political decisions. Again, British armies invaded. Again, military operations advanced rapidly. Again, parts of Afghanistan fell under British pressure. But once again, the deeper the British became involved inside Afghanistan, the more unstable the situation grew. Afghan resistance intensified fiercely. Many tribal fighters viewed the British presence not merely as foreign politics, but as an attack on Afghan independence, culture, religion, and dignity itself. This is something outsiders repeatedly failed to understand about Afghanistan. For many Afghans, resistance was not simply military, it was emotional, cultural, spiritual, tribal. Foreign occupation often united groups that normally disagreed with each other, because even tribes with rivalries could unite against outsiders attempting to dominate the land. And the geography once again became Afghanistan's greatest ally. British forces struggled with mountainous terrain, supply lines, tribal ambushes, and constant instability. Even technologically advanced armies found themselves exhausted by the endless complexity of Afghan warfare. The mountains did not care about imperial ambition. Winter did not care about military pride. Afghanistan slowly drained invading powers psychologically, economically, and militarily. Eventually, Britain achieved partial political goals, but never full control. Instead, Afghanistan became a buffer state between the British and Russian empires, a country trapped between giants. And while the great powers played geopolitical games, ordinary Afghans paid the price. Villages were destroyed, communities suffered, tribal conflicts deepened, economic hardship spread. Generations grew up surrounded by war and instability. Yet despite everything, Afghanistan still remained independent. Unlike India, Afghanistan never fully became a British colony. That fact mattered deeply, because for many Afghans, survival itself became proof of national pride. The British Empire controlled massive parts of the world, but Afghanistan still stood unconquered, and this reputation spread globally. Afghanistan was becoming known as the place where imperial confidence collapsed. But the story was far from over, because while Britain struggled to secure influence in Afghanistan, the modern world itself was changing rapidly. Industrialization transformed warfare. Global politics became more dangerous. New ideologies spread across continents. And eventually, the entire world moved toward catastrophe. World War I. Although Afghanistan did not become a major battlefield during the First World War, the conflict weakened old empires dramatically. The Ottoman Empire weakened. Russia collapsed into revolution. Britain suffered enormous economic and military strain. Suddenly, the balance of global power began shifting, and Afghan leaders saw opportunity. In 1919, Afghanistan launched the Third Anglo-Afghan War under King Amanullah Khan. This war was shorter than previous conflicts, but historically extremely important, because after the conflict, Britain officially recognized Afghanistan's independence in foreign affairs. For the first time in modern history, Afghanistan gained full control over its own foreign policy without British domination. This moment became a symbol of national victory. Amanullah Khan emerged as an ambitious, modernizing ruler, and he dreamed of transforming Afghanistan into a strong, modern nation capable of standing proudly among the countries of the world. He introduced reforms, built schools, encouraged modernization, expanded diplomatic relations, promoted infrastructure projects, and attempted to reduce some traditional restrictions inside society. But Afghanistan's internal reality remained extremely complicated. Modernization inside deeply tribal and conservative societies often creates tension. Some Afghans supported reform enthusiastically. Others viewed rapid change as dangerous, foreign, or threatening to traditional Islamic and tribal values. This conflict between modernization and tradition would become one of the defining struggles of modern Afghan history. Again and again throughout the 20th century, Afghanistan would wrestle with the same painful question: How can the country modernize without losing its identity? And unfortunately, outside powers continued interfering while Afghanistan struggled to answer that question itself. During the 20th century, global politics became increasingly dominated by powerful ideologies: capitalism, communism, nationalism, revolutionary movements, and eventually, another superpower began focusing heavily on Afghanistan, the Soviet Union. To the north, the Soviet Union expanded influence across Central Asia after the Russian Revolution. Communist ideology spread aggressively. Moscow wanted friendly governments near its borders, and Afghanistan once again became strategically important. Just as Britain and Russia once competed over Afghanistan during the Great Game, now a new global rivalry was emerging: the Cold War. And once again, Afghanistan stood directly in the middle of powerful empires preparing to shape its future. But this time, the coming storm would be even worse than before, because the next invasion of Afghanistan would not only destroy cities and governments, it would help reshape global terrorism, modern warfare, Middle Eastern politics, and even the future of the entire world for decades to come. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter Afghanistan, and millions of lives were about to change forever. By the second half of the 20th century, Afghanistan once again stood between powerful forces larger than itself. But this time, the world had entered a completely different era. The age of kings and colonial empires was fading. Now the world was divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry became known as the Cold War. Unlike previous world wars, the Cold War was not fought mainly through direct battles between superpowers. Instead, conflicts exploded inside smaller countries trapped between competing ideologies. Capitalism against communism, Western influence against Soviet influence, democracy against revolutionary socialism. And once again, Afghanistan found itself standing in the middle of a global struggle it could not escape. During the 1960s and 1970s, Afghanistan experienced political instability, economic problems, ideological division, and growing pressure from both internal factions and foreign powers. The country was still struggling with the same painful question that had haunted it for generations: how could Afghanistan modernize without destroying its traditional identity? Some Afghan leaders wanted rapid modernization inspired by Western or Soviet models. Others feared losing religion, tribal values, local traditions, and cultural independence. The tension between these visions slowly became explosive, and then everything began collapsing. In 1973, King Zahir Shah was overthrown in a coup led by his cousin Mohammad Daoud Khan. Afghanistan's monarchy ended. At first, many hoped the new government would stabilize the country and modernize it carefully. But political divisions deepened rapidly. Communist factions inside Afghanistan gained influence. Internal rivalries intensified. Protests expanded. Religious leaders grew alarmed. Tribal resistance increased. Then in 1978, another violent coup changed Afghanistan forever. The Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in what became known as the Sour Revolution. The new communist government immediately launched radical reforms: land redistribution, changes to education, restrictions on traditional power structures, attempts to weaken tribal authority, policies viewed by many religious Afghans as attacks on Islamic identity, and this was the moment Afghanistan exploded into chaos. The communist government badly underestimated Afghan society. Many rural communities rejected the reforms completely. Religious scholars condemned the regime. Tribal leaders organized resistance. Entire regions revolted violently. The government responded with arrests, torture, executions, and brutal crackdowns. Fear spread everywhere. Villages burned. Political prisoners disappeared. Families fled into mountains and neighboring countries. Afghanistan was descending toward civil war, and the Soviet Union was watching closely. Moscow feared the collapse of the communist Afghan government would weaken Soviet influence in the region and potentially strengthen Western or Islamic opposition movements near Soviet borders. So in December 1979, The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Thousands of Soviet troops crossed the border. Tanks rolled into Afghan cities. Aircraft filled the skies. Special forces carried out assassinations and military operations. The Soviet leadership believed the intervention would stabilize the country quickly. They expected to secure the communist government and crush resistance within a short period. But they made the same mistake many empires before them had made. They believed Afghanistan could be controlled through military superiority alone. At first, the Soviet military appeared overwhelming. The Soviet Union possessed one of the strongest armies on Earth. Modern tanks, heavy artillery, advanced aircraft, massive troop numbers, sophisticated intelligence systems. Against them stood Afghan resistance fighters with limited resources, fragmented leadership, and little formal military structure. From the outside, the outcome seemed obvious, but Afghanistan had defeated powerful invaders before, and slowly, history began repeating itself. Resistance groups known as the Mujahideen started organizing across the country. Many were deeply motivated by religion, tribal loyalty, nationalism, or hatred toward foreign occupation. Some were farmers, some were students, some were tribal fighters, some were religious scholars, but together they formed one of the most determined resistance movements of the Cold War, and Afghanistan's geography once again became a nightmare for invading forces. The mountains protected resistance fighters, caves became military hideouts, narrow valleys turned into deadly ambush zones, supply routes stretched dangerously across hostile terrain. Soviet soldiers often found themselves fighting an enemy that could attack suddenly and disappear into mountains before retaliation arrived. The war became brutal beyond imagination. Villages suspected of helping resistance fighters were bombed. Entire communities were destroyed. Landmines covered huge areas. Helicopter gunships attacked mountain regions relentlessly. Millions of Afghan civilians suffered horribly. Families fled across borders into Pakistan and Iran. Children grew up inside refugee camps. Cities became battle zones. Farmland was destroyed. Poverty spread everywhere. The Soviet-Afghan War slowly transformed Afghanistan into one of the most devastated countries on Earth. But the conflict was no longer only about Afghanistan, because the United States saw opportunity. For Washington, Afghanistan became a chance to weaken the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Americans remembered how expensive and humiliating Vietnam had been for the United States. Now they wanted the Soviet Union to experience its own version of that nightmare. So the United States, along with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other allies, began supporting the Mujahideen resistance. Money flowed into Afghanistan. Weapons entered secretly. Training programs expanded. Foreign volunteers arrived from different parts of the Muslim world. One of those foreign volunteers was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. At the time, few people realized how important that name would later become. To many outsiders during the 1980s, the Afghan resistance looked heroic. The Mujahideen were portrayed as fighters resisting foreign occupation and communist expansion, and in many ways, they truly were resisting invasion. But beneath the surface, something extremely dangerous was also developing. Afghanistan was becoming militarized beyond control. Foreign intelligence agencies flooded the region. Extremist ideologies spread among certain groups. Weapons became everywhere. War became normal for an entire generation. Young boys grew up surrounded by violence, displacement, and destruction. And the longer the war continued, the more impossible peace became. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was slowly bleeding. The war became incredibly expensive. Soviet soldiers died in large numbers. Public frustration inside the Soviet Union increased. Morale weakened. International criticism expanded. Afghanistan was becoming exactly what it had become for previous empires. A slow trap. Not a single sudden defeat, but years of exhaustion, frustration, economic damage, and psychological collapse. The Soviet military could win battles, but it could not truly control Afghanistan. And after nearly a decade of brutal war, the Soviet Union finally made its decision. In 1989, Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan. The images shocked the world. Another superpower had entered Afghanistan with confidence and eventually left defeated. For many people across the globe, Afghanistan had once again proven why it was called the graveyard of empires. But the Soviet withdrawal did not bring peace. In fact, the most dangerous chapter of Afghanistan's modern history was only beginning. Because after years of war, millions of weapons remained inside the country. Powerful armed factions competed for control. Foreign powers still interfered. The government was collapsing, and the Mujahideen groups that once fought together against the Soviets were now preparing to fight each other. Afghanistan was about to descend into one of the darkest civil wars in modern history. And from that chaos, a new force would rise. The Taliban. When the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, many people around the world believed the war was finally over. Newspapers described the Soviet retreat as a historic humiliation. Political leaders celebrated what they saw as the victory of resistance fighters against one of the most powerful military forces on earth. Across parts of the Muslim world, Afghan fighters were praised as heroes who had defeated a superpower through faith, sacrifice, and endurance. But inside Afghanistan itself, there was very little celebration. The country had been shattered almost beyond recognition. Entire cities were damaged. Millions of civilians had fled their homes. Families had been separated for years. Huge regions remained covered in landmines. An entire generation of children had grown up surrounded by war, refugee camps, destruction, hunger, fear, and death. Afghanistan had technically survived another empire, but survival came at a horrifying price. And even worse, the Soviet withdrawal did not create peace. It created a vacuum. The communist Afghan government managed to remain in power for a short time after the Soviet exit, but its foundations were collapsing rapidly. Different Mujahideen factions that had once united against the Soviets now turned their weapons toward each other. Former allies became rivals almost immediately. Tribal divisions deepened, ethnic tensions expanded, regional commanders fought for territory, political leaders competed for power. Foreign governments secretly supported different armed groups hoping to protect their own interests. Afghanistan slowly descended into full-scale civil war. Kabul, the capital city, became one of the most tragic symbols of this chaos. Different factions bombarded neighborhoods with rockets and artillery. Civilians were trapped between rival militias. Homes collapsed, markets burned, entire districts turned into ruins. Families hid underground while explosions destroyed the streets above them. Thousands of ordinary Afghans who had already survived the Soviet war suddenly found themselves trapped inside another nightmare, created not by foreign invaders this time, but by Afghan factions fighting each other for control. For many civilians, this period felt even more painful than the Soviet occupation, because hope itself began dying. People who once believed victory against the Soviets would bring stability instead watched their country collapse into lawlessness. Kidnappings increased. Armed checkpoints spread everywhere. Corruption expanded. Bandit groups controlled roads. Violence became part of daily life. Parents feared sending children outside. Traders feared transporting goods. Villages feared armed commanders more than governments. Afghanistan no longer looked like a functioning nation. It looked like a wounded land abandoned by history itself. And inside this chaos, a new movement quietly began forming. The movement emerged mainly among religious students in southern Afghanistan and refugee camps across Pakistan. Many of these young men had grown up during the Soviet war. They had known almost nothing except conflict, displacement, poverty, and violence. Some studied inside religious schools known as madrasas. Many were deeply frustrated by the corruption, brutality, and endless fighting between Mujahideen factions. They believed Afghanistan needed order, unity, and strict Islamic governance to end the chaos consuming the country. These students became known as the Taliban, a word derived from talib, meaning student. At first, few people took them seriously. Afghanistan already contained countless armed groups and factions. But the Taliban possessed something extremely powerful during a time of total disorder: simplicity. They promised security. They promised to disarm corrupt warlords. They promised to reopen roads safely. They promised to restore Islamic order. And after years of horrifying instability, many exhausted civilians were desperate for any force capable of ending the violence. The Taliban's rise happened with shocking speed. In 1994, they captured Kandahar. Many local communities initially welcomed them because they reduced banditry and restored basic security in areas they controlled. Truck drivers could travel more safely. Some markets reopened. Armed checkpoints disappeared in certain regions. Compared to the chaos of civil war, the Taliban appeared disciplined and organized, but their movement was also deeply rigid. The Taliban followed an extremely strict interpretation of Islamic law, mixed with tribal conservatism, shaped by decades of war and isolation. As they expanded across Afghanistan, they imposed harsh restrictions on society. Women faced severe limitations on education, employment, and public life. Men were forced to follow strict dress and behavior codes. Music, entertainment, many forms of art and cultural expression were banned or restricted. Punishments became public and severe. Fear spread rapidly across areas under Taliban control. Yet, despite international criticism, the Taliban continued advancing militarily because many rival factions remained divided and unpopular. By 1996, the Taliban captured Kabul. Afghanistan once again entered a new political era. For the first time in years, much of the country came under centralized authority. But stability came through fear and strict control rather than reconciliation. Afghanistan became increasingly isolated internationally. Only a few countries officially recognized the Taliban government. Economic hardship worsened. Human rights criticism expanded globally. And inside Afghanistan, ordinary civilians continued carrying the burden of decades of uninterrupted conflict. But while the world focused on Taliban rule inside Afghanistan, another dangerous development was unfolding quietly in the background. During the anti-Soviet jihad of the 1980s, many foreign fighters had traveled to Afghanistan. Some eventually left after the Soviet withdrawal. Others remained connected through networks built during the war. Among the most important figures was Osama bin Laden. After returning briefly to Saudi Arabia, bin Laden became increasingly hostile toward the United States, especially after American troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. Eventually, he relocated back to Afghanistan, where the Taliban allowed him and his organization, Al-Qaeda, to operate inside the country. This decision would change world history forever. Throughout the late 1990s, Al-Qaeda expanded its international operations while based in Afghanistan. Terrorist attacks linked to the organization targeted American embassies, military sites, and civilians. The United States demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban refused, arguing for evidence, negotiations, or religious procedures according to their interpretation of Islamic law. Tensions between the Taliban government and the United States intensified steadily. Then came September 11, 2001. On that morning, the world watched in shock as hijacked airplanes struck the World Trade Center towers in New York and the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The attacks became one of the most defining moments of the 21st century. Within hours, global politics changed completely. The United States blamed Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden for the attacks. American leaders demanded immediate action from the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Again, the Taliban refused to surrender bin Laden under American conditions. And once again, Afghanistan became the center of a global war. In October 2001, the United States launched military operations against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. American airstrikes began hitting Taliban positions. Special forces entered Afghanistan. Intelligence agencies coordinated with anti-Taliban Afghan factions known as the Northern Alliance. Within weeks, Taliban defenses collapsed rapidly in major cities. Kabul fell, Kandahar fell. Taliban leaders disappeared into mountains and across borders. From the outside, it looked like another quick military victory by a global superpower. But Afghanistan had taught history this lesson many times before. Winning the opening invasion was not the same as controlling the country. At first, many Afghans hoped the fall of the Taliban might finally bring peace after decades of suffering. International aid entered the country, schools reopened in some areas, women regained access to education and employment in urban centers, foreign governments promised reconstruction, democracy, infrastructure, and modernization. Billions of dollars flowed into Afghanistan, but beneath the optimism, enormous problems were already growing. Corruption spread inside the new Afghan government. Powerful warlords regained influence. Foreign military operations sometimes caused civilian casualties, creating anger among local populations. Tribal complexities remained poorly understood by outsiders. Rural regions often received little meaningful development compared to Kabul. And slowly the Taliban began reorganizing. They did not disappear. They adapted. Just as Afghan resistance movements had resisted previous empires from mountains and villages, the Taliban launched a long insurgency against NATO and American forces. Suicide bombings increased. Roadside explosives spread across the country. Assassinations targeted officials, teachers, journalists, and civilians. Entire regions became unstable again. Meanwhile, foreign troops remained trapped inside a conflict growing more complicated every year. The United States possessed overwhelming military superiority. Advanced aircraft, drones, satellites, intelligence systems, special forces, armored vehicles, and modern weapons gave NATO enormous battlefield advantages. But Afghanistan was never defeated, only through battlefield calculations. The deeper foreign powers became involved, the more complicated the war became politically, culturally, economically, and psychologically. American soldiers fought in extreme conditions across mountains and deserts far from home. Multiple generations of troops rotated through deployments. Thousands died. Tens of thousands were wounded physically or mentally. Trillions of dollars were spent. Western publics slowly grew exhausted by the endless war, and Afghan civilians once again suffered the most. Children grew up hearing explosions instead of peace. Villages were trapped between Taliban fighters and foreign military operations. Fear became permanent. Poverty remained widespread. Entire families lived surrounded by uncertainty year after year. Many Afghans began asking painful questions. If the Soviets failed, if the British failed, if so many empires failed before, could the United States truly succeed where others had not? The war stretched longer and longer. Years became decades. Presidents changed in Washington. Strategies changed repeatedly. Troop numbers increased and decreased. Peace talks failed and restarted. Military offensives continued endlessly, yet Afghanistan still remained unstable, and slowly something shocking began happening. The Taliban started returning stronger, not necessarily because all Afghans supported them, but because endless war had exhausted the population. Corruption weakened trust in the Afghan government. Many rural communities felt abandoned or caught between competing forces. Some viewed the Taliban as less corrupt than officials backed by foreign powers. Others simply wanted the fighting to stop, no matter who ruled. History was repeating itself once again. Another superpower had entered Afghanistan with confidence, technology, and military strength. And once again, the war became endless. Then finally, after nearly 20 years of conflict, the United States decided to leave. The withdrawal process accelerated during 2021, and what happened next shocked the world. Province after province fell rapidly to the Taliban. Afghan security forces collapsed in many areas. Government control disappeared with astonishing speed. Then Kabul itself fell. Images spread globally showing desperate crowds at the airport, civilians clinging to departing aircraft, families terrified about the future, and Taliban fighters entering the capital after 2 decades of war. For many observers across the world, the scenes felt hauntingly familiar. Another empire had entered Afghanistan promising transformation. Another empire had eventually withdrawn, and Afghanistan once again stood at the center of global debate, fear, tragedy, and uncertainty. But beneath all the wars, invasions, ideologies, and headlines lies a deeper question the world still struggles to answer. Why has Afghanistan endured so much suffering across centuries? Why does this land repeatedly become the battlefield of empires? And why, despite endless destruction, does Afghanistan continue surviving when so many powerful invaders eventually collapse around it? Because to understand Afghanistan fully is to understand something uncomfortable about human history itself. Power alone has never guaranteed victory. Technology alone has never guaranteed control, and empires throughout history repeatedly underestimate the strength of people willing to endure hardship longer than outsiders can endure war. For thousands of years, Afghanistan has stood at the center of one repeating historical pattern, so terrifying that even the greatest empires on earth eventually learned to fear it. Again and again, powerful civilizations entered Afghanistan believing they were different from everyone who came before them. Alexander the Great believed his military genius could stabilize the region. The British Empire believed its global dominance could control the mountains. The Soviet Union believed communist power and modern weaponry could reshape Afghan society. The United States believed advanced technology, intelligence systems, and international coalitions could finally succeed where others failed. And every single one of them eventually discovered the same painful truth. Afghanistan is not conquered easily because Afghanistan is not simply a battlefield. It is a psychological war against time itself. That is the deeper secret many outsiders never fully understood. Most empires fight wars expecting decisive victories. They depend on organized systems, stable supply lines, economic strength, political support back home, and military momentum. But Afghanistan slowly destroys those advantages over time. The mountains isolate armies, the terrain exhausts logistics, the tribal structure complicates alliances, the harsh climate weakens morale, the endless instability drains economies, and eventually, foreign populations thousands of miles away begin asking the same dangerous question: why are we still fighting there? This is how Afghanistan defeats empires, not always through one giant military victory, but through exhaustion, through patience, through survival. Afghanistan has outlasted invaders again and again because the people defending their homeland usually possess something foreign armies often struggle to maintain for long periods: the willingness to suffer endlessly without surrendering psychologically. This does not mean Afghanistan never loses battles. It has lost countless battles throughout history. Cities have fallen, governments have collapsed, civilizations have been destroyed, millions of Afghans have suffered unimaginable pain. But what repeatedly survives is resistance itself, and resistance becomes incredibly difficult to defeat when geography, tribal identity, religion, culture, and history all combine together. The Hindu Kush Mountains are not just physical terrain. They are part of Afghanistan's historical defense system. Foreign armies entering these regions often discover they are fighting not only armed groups, but the environment itself. Winter freezes movement, mountain passes isolate units. Villages hidden between valleys become impossible to monitor completely. Local fighters disappear into terrain they have known since childhood. This reality frustrated every empire that entered Afghanistan. Modern military power looks overwhelming on paper, but Afghanistan repeatedly turned advanced military strategy into slow confusion, even in modern times. The strongest armies in the world struggled against fighters using basic weapons and deep local knowledge of terrain, and geography alone is not the full explanation. Another reason Afghanistan became so difficult to control lies inside its social structure. Unlike highly centralized societies, Afghanistan historically developed through tribal systems, local loyalties, ethnic networks, religious identity, and regional independence. Power inside Afghanistan rarely functioned in a simple top-down structure. Control over Kabul did not automatically mean control over the countryside. Foreign powers repeatedly misunderstood this. They often believed capturing the capital city meant victory, but Afghanistan's real power frequently existed far beyond government buildings, inside villages, inside tribes, inside family loyalties, inside local religious authority, inside mountain communities outsiders barely understood. This made long-term occupation incredibly difficult, because even when governments collapsed, local resistance networks survived, and throughout history, foreign powers consistently underestimated how deeply Afghans valued independence. For many Afghans, foreign occupation became more than political conflict. It became personal. It became connected to honor, dignity, religion, tribe, family, and survival. This emotional dimension transformed wars into generational struggles. And once wars become generational, victory becomes almost impossible for outside powers trying to maintain public support back home. The British Empire eventually lost patience. The Soviet Union eventually lost patience. The United States eventually lost patience. But Afghanistan itself could not leave. Afghans remained trapped inside the war whether they wanted it or not. That difference changes everything, because foreign armies fight far from home. Afghans fight inside their home, and history shows that populations defending their homeland often endure suffering longer than invading powers expect. But Afghanistan's story is not only about resistance. This is extremely important to understand. Many documentaries reduce Afghanistan into a simple image of endless war. That image is incomplete. Afghanistan also possesses a deep history of culture, scholarship, spirituality, trade, poetry, and civilization stretching back thousands of years. Long before modern conflicts, Afghanistan connected worlds together. The Silk Road crossed these lands carrying goods, ideas, religions, languages, science, and philosophy between civilizations. Ancient Afghan cities once stood among important centers of trade and learning. Buddhist monasteries flourished here before Islam spread across the region. Islamic scholarship later expanded deeply through Afghan society. Poets, scholars, scientists, traders, architects, and travelers moved through these mountains for centuries. Cities like Herat and Ghazni once became centers of art and intellectual life admired across Asia. Afghanistan was not created by war alone. It was shaped by civilization as well. But sadly, modern history often remembers Afghanistan mainly through conflict, because the country spent generations trapped between global rivalries and foreign interventions. This repeated interference damaged Afghan society deeply. During the Cold War, Afghanistan became a battleground between superpowers. Foreign governments armed factions for strategic interests. Weapons flooded the region. Extremism spread through war networks. Refugee crises destabilized generations. Then after 2001, another global intervention reshaped the country again. For ordinary Afghan civilians, these geopolitical struggles often brought endless suffering rather than stability. Children born during one war grew old enough to fight in another. Some Afghans lived almost their entire lives without experiencing real peace. Imagine what that does psychologically to a society. Imagine growing up hearing helicopters, explosions, gunfire, political fear, and uncertainty for decades. Imagine watching foreign powers enter your country promising peace, only for the violence to continue year after year. This is part of Afghanistan's tragedy. The world often debates Afghanistan through politics, ideology, terrorism, empire strategy, or military analysis. But beneath all those discussions are millions of ordinary human beings trying to survive history itself. Farmers trying to protect families, children trying to attend school safely, parents trying to escape violence, communities trying to rebuild homes destroyed repeatedly. Afghanistan's pain cannot be understood fully only through maps or wars. It must also be understood through human exhaustion. And yet, despite everything, Afghanistan still survives. That may be the most astonishing part of its entire story. Empires collapsed, invaders withdrew, governments changed, wars consumed generations, but Afghanistan still exists, still standing among the mountains, still resisting complete destruction, still carrying scars from every century that passed through it. This survival created the famous phrase, "the graveyard of empires." But some historians argue the phrase is slightly misunderstood. Afghanistan did not literally destroy every empire militarily. The British Empire survived Afghanistan. The Soviet Union collapsed, partly because of many internal problems beyond Afghanistan. The United States remained globally powerful after withdrawal, but Afghanistan repeatedly exposed the limits of imperial power. That is the real meaning behind the phrase. Afghanistan reveals that military superiority alone cannot guarantee control over determined populations defending their homeland. It reveals that geography can humble technology. It reveals that empires often underestimate cultures they barely understand. And perhaps most importantly, Afghanistan reveals how dangerous it becomes when powerful nations treat smaller countries as strategic game boards instead of human societies. Throughout history, foreign powers repeatedly viewed Afghanistan through ambition, a gateway to India, a Cold War battlefield, a buffer zone, a counter-terrorism target, a geopolitical prize. But Afghanistan was never merely a strategic location. It was always a living civilization filled with real people, carrying memories, traditions, fears, hopes, and pain across generations. And maybe that is why Afghanistan remained impossible to fully control. Because empires often tried to dominate the land without truly understanding the people. Even today, Afghanistan remains uncertain. The Taliban returned to power after the American withdrawal. Economic hardship continues. Humanitarian crises affect millions. Political recognition remains controversial internationally. Women's rights debates dominate global discussions. Security concerns continue shaping foreign policy around the region. The future remains unclear, but one thing history has already proven beyond doubt. Afghanistan cannot be understood simplistically. It is not merely a war zone, not merely a failed state, not merely a battlefield between superpowers. It is one of the most historically resilient lands on Earth. A land that stood at the crossroads of civilizations for thousands of years, a land where empires repeatedly arrived believing they could reshape history, only to discover history was already waiting for them inside the mountains. And perhaps the greatest lesson Afghanistan teaches humanity is this: no empire lasts forever. No military power remains unbeatable forever. No civilization remains dominant forever. Because history eventually humbles everyone, and few places on Earth have humbled powerful nations more consistently than Afghanistan. So when people call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires, they are not only talking about war, they are talking about arrogance. They are talking about what happens when powerful nations believe military strength alone can control the spirit of a people who have survived suffering for thousands of years. Because throughout history, empire after empire entered Afghanistan, believing they would succeed where everyone before them failed. Alexander came, the British came, the Soviets came, America came. Each one arrived with confidence, with strategy, with weapons, with promises, with power. And yet somehow, Afghanistan remains standing after all of them, broken many times, wounded many times, but never fully erased. That is what makes Afghanistan one of the most extraordinary places in human history. This land has witnessed ancient civilizations, Silk Road traders, Buddhist kingdoms, Islamic empires, Mongol destruction, colonial invasions, Cold War battles, terrorism, modern warfare, and global superpower conflict, all across the same mountains. Very few countries on Earth carry history this heavy. And maybe the saddest part of Afghanistan's story is this: generation after generation of ordinary Afghan people kept paying the price for battles created by rulers, empires, ideologies, and global politics far bigger than themselves. Children grew up hearing explosions instead of peace. Families lost homes again and again. Entire generations learned survival before they learned stability. And still, Afghanistan survived. That survival itself became its identity. But history also leaves humanity with a warning, because Afghanistan teaches us that power without understanding becomes dangerous. When empires stop seeing human beings and start seeing maps, war becomes endless. When nations treat countries like strategic prizes instead of living civilizations, suffering spreads across generations. And maybe that is the deepest lesson hidden inside Afghanistan's story. No empire is permanent. No military is unstoppable. No superpower controls history forever. Because eventually, time humbles everyone. And sometimes, the mountains remember longer than empires do. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to subscribe to Story Glow and Grow English for more untold stories, forgotten histories and powerful journeys that shape the modern world. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, which empire do you think underestimated Afghanistan the most? And from which country are you watching this documentary today?